Dear listeners, we welcome you to the next podcast of the Bolster project. And today, in this episode, we're going to talk about sustainability and challenges related to that, as well as the process of just transition and recommendations. What do you think projects such as Bolster has done to contribute to make just transition process go further and perhaps even attempting to making it a bit more just?
I think projects like Bolster do something really important in that it gives us a space to actually ask this question of like, what is justice and who for? Which I think is a conversation that we really lack often in the policy scape, because obviously we have to be driven by these principles. But by having a big project like Bolster that has had the complexity built into it to acknowledge how difficult this can be and to do work on the ground with people experiencing this, I think it really brings this nuance to a conversation that could otherwise be very easily overlooked. When we look at like the scope of the Bolster project, in many ways, it's quite remarkable how many different communities, like different historical trajectories, different economies were all brought into conversation together. And I think that's something that really adds a lot to the conversation about just transition.
Thank you, Emma. What do you think are still needs that are not addressed yet and should be taken into account?
Before we started to move towards a greener economy and more sustainable projects, there were already people who were struggling across the EU. And now there's a new dimension added to that with the transition. And actually, these different complexities and different dimensions of inequality are overlapping. And in my mind, so much more needs to be done to ask these questions. Who is winning and who is losing? And what are the consequences of that? Because actually, many of the long-term consequences that we might be seeing from these transitions, like more populist voting patterns, energy communities, many of these are not populations that would often appear on our radar as necessarily at risk or particularly vulnerable. Do we therefore focus our attention entirely on them? How do we deal with the communities that were already marginalized before this? And I think Bolster did a lot of this work in the project, but I think it really shows the spaces and the opportunities to keep working on these kind of really difficult issues that if we're in the policy scape and if we're really focusing on the economics, we simply can't do.
What do you think are the next steps that are important to implement in order for the process to keep going and reach its objectives?
I think the EU needs to ask the question of, if the Just Transition Fund isn't renewed, then what comes next? How can they better address the different needs of different countries, different communities, different economies with whatever is the successor to the Just Transition Fund? For people doing research, I think we need to be looking at what are the consequences now of these interventions, because we're really only starting to see it. And then for people who work in these communities, for NGOs and community groups, I think it's really important to be aware of what has already happened and maybe wasn't necessarily labeled as part of these just transitions, but is part of this wider societal shift that we're seeing towards these more sustainable ways of living, sustainable economies, and to make sure that people are aware of this, are aware of the way that Europe is going, that this is genuinely happening in earnest and at quite a rapid speed. So to make sure that people feel that they're included and that there are opportunities for them to engage, even if that's not necessarily through the most formal participation methods of, EU consultations and so on. The whole process of just transition is actually kind of enigmatic and amorphous, but when we can start to find the community groups and the people who are making the most of it, there's a way that we can think about opening that up and giving more people an opportunity to actually benefit from this, because it's a lot of money, it's a lot of interest. And for many communities, it is an opportunity. And I think if we don't engage with community groups and people living in these places, it's very easy that they will just miss it.
I've recently checked on the Deutsche Welle. There was an information saying that there are 100,000 of jobs in the sustainability sector that are missing right now. And there were some findings from the reports of Bolster around that. Do you think there is something that the private sector, that businesses could do to also make this just transition a little bit more just and including more people on board? I don't know if you just spontaneously have something.
Many of these people anticipated this and had a very clear plan, and maybe they aren't actually available for a lot of these reskilling opportunities and these gaps that need filling in the workforce. So I think what we're seeing for the companies that are pivoting really well is that they're starting to look to different communities, younger people, people from more international backgrounds, and asking, okay, how can we think differently about recruiting people into our workforce beyond the people that we kind of assumed the traditional workforce that they would have always tapped into? Because that's just not the economy that we have in this part of the world anymore. And I think many other countries, I know Poland has a much bigger workforce that's currently being kind of shifted with this just transition. But even then, there are so many opportunities if they think about reaching out to migrant communities, women who might not have been their traditional kind of recruitment ground. I think there's really something to be said there. And, you know, if we're asking a question of how do we make sure this benefits everyone and the more marginalized, then I think it's crucial. Otherwise, it can't be fully just.
Is there anything else you would like to add from your personal perspective to the topic?
I think there's a real question about whether communities that have already experienced really drastic transitions can ever perceive this as just. I think there's also like a really crucial need to understand that sometimes top-down interventions are unpopular. And the biggest thing that all of these processes aren't really giving communities is time. If we don't give space to these conversations because they're difficult and because they're often with people that maybe wouldn't traditionally engage with these processes, then how can no one be left behind if we don't want to talk to the people who don't want to engage in the first place? The only answer I have is time, which is not something we have an abundance of, but some balance is needed, I think.
Oh yeah, did you get any answer for yourself?
It's finding the people who do have time, academics, for example. If you're working in a policy scape, if you're working with funding metrics, it becomes tighter and tighter. So it becomes a question of looking around and going, who has a little bit more flexibility in the way they work? Also artistics, like more artistic engagement. You need people who work on different timeframes and in different ways as broadly as possible. There was an amazing photography project just north of here that was about people's different like perspectives of the life course, and they ended up doing like a spoken word performance piece. And that for me was one of the best examples I've seen of like community engagement. And it wasn't explicitly about just transition, but the themes were so close that it proves it's possible. It just sometimes needs people to think outside the box a bit.
How do you think that helps them to think about the future? Maybe to bring this point a bit towards the end goal?
I think it's the sense of agency, the sense that they have some control over what that future looks like. And that agency doesn't necessarily need to be entirely enacted through surveys and metrics and questions of engaging in funding mechanisms, that there are other ways that they can be part of this conversation about what that future looks like. Often I think that it's really hard for people to imagine what future they want, because there's this sense that, well, things shouldn't change, and why do they have to change, especially in communities where they've been through such drastic changes like reunification, for example. And I think even just giving people a little sense that they have some control over what this looks like, and that there is maybe more limited than it should be, maybe too quick, but there's some capacity for their engagement, and that means that they are listened to, hopefully. But I think there's a huge responsibility that comes with that, and that if people do express what they want, then we have some degree of responsibility to at least try and make sure that trickles all the way up the chain back to the people who make some of the big decisions. But the other hope is that whatever the EU come up with next to support these shifts and transitions, that it has space for this. I think the Just Transition Fund was a great attempt, but I think we've all seen how complicated and difficult the governance structures were. So whatever they move forward with, hopefully they can take that into account.
Is there anything specific that you would like to see European Union develop as the next tool?
I think something that is explicitly about sociocultural impacts for me is really crucial. It was in the Just Transition Fund, but increasingly it got pushed to the edge because it is easier and it's more timely to deal with the economics, and questions of things like training and education obviously are super important, but therefore the sociocultural questions, they get pushed to the wayside. And I think the people who maybe aren't on the absolute front line of the transition but are very close to it, they sort of get left out of these funding mechanisms. And this sense that infrastructure projects are great and people will benefit from them, but they maybe don't understand that all that money went into new tarmac. It's hard for people to picture. So there's also something about sociocultural programs that they're things that people can relate to and remember and express themselves through, whether that's museums or community events or spaces that people can use. I think there isn't a need for these funding mechanisms to acknowledge that we need some PR, we need some visibility for this. Otherwise, the transition will happen and people won't even realize how much money's been spent.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy, for your wonderful contributions, for your thoughts and sharing. Is there any final remarks you would like to make or a statement?
I think just that this question of no one left behind I think we really need to put this as a central component moving forward. And that means no one. Otherwise, we only risk perpetuating these inequalities and these divisions. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but I think the risk is really high if we don't try.
Thank you so much. And I wish you a good day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.